Thank you all for being here today. My name is Carolyn Romero. I'm the executive editor of the Law Review, and I'm so happy that we have such a great turnout and that you're all here today on a Friday afternoon. I have the privilege of introducing our incredible Dean, Onwuachi-Willig. As I'm sure you know, Dean Onwuachi-Willig is a renowned legal scholar and expert in critical race theory, in addition to being our dean. And we could not think of a better person to kick us off today and to lead our conversation in our second panel later today. So thank you also, Dean, for all your support in putting together this event. We couldn't have done this without you. So without further ado, we can get started. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. As I'm Onwuachi-Willig, I'm Dean of the Law School, and I'm the Ryan Moth-Gallo Professor of Law, which is the very first endowed professorship in critical race theory in the nation. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2024 BU Law Review Symposium, Countering Attacks on Diversity. And I can't imagine a more timely and important topic than this one, and so I'm glad that we're having it. Paramount to our mission at Boston University School of Law is our deep and long-standing commitment to diversity and inclusion, both in the law school and the legal profession. In fact, our profession remains one of the least diverse employment sectors in the country, and this long-standing lack of full representation in the legal profession has had and continues to have far-reaching implications for equity and justice in our society. As I'm sure you're all aware, less than a year ago, the U.S. Supreme Court issued an opinion that held that Harvard College and the University of North Carolina violated the Equal Protection Clause in their use of race in their admissions processes. And in the wake of their ruling, colleges and universities have had to adjust to the restrictions placed on using an applicant's checkbox for identification of their race on their application, to be distinguished from speaking about their experiences with race. And this has really been a step backward in many ways, at least to my mind, and it negates nearly 50 years of precedent, and it presents a real challenge to our mission of recruiting and retaining a diverse body of students who in turn then diversify our legal profession, which very, very sorely needs to be diversified. The challenges that we face do not end with SFFA. Since 2021, more than 30 states have introduced more than 100 bills to either restrict or regulate diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. In Florida, for example, the Board of Education recently announced a rule banning colleges from using state and federal funds on DEI initiatives. Last summer, Governor Greg Abbott signed Texas Senate Bill 17, which requires all state-funded colleges and universities to close their DEI offices. And in January, Governor Spencer Cox signed Utah anti-DEI bill HB 261, banning all government and universities from having offices dedicated to promoting diversity. Laws like these mean that our society faces barriers not only to bringing students from underrepresented groups into law schools, but also to providing the critical support that is needed for students once they're in these very environments. Finally, I have to mention the attack on the curriculum in so many places, particularly the attack on critical race theory. Since January of 2021, 44 states have introduced bills or taken steps that would restrict teaching critical race theory, largely in public K-12 schools where it isn't taught, that limit how teachers in our K-12 schools, how teachers in colleges and universities can discuss racism, and that impose censorship and book bans in our schools. This movement against critical race theory is a threat to academic freedom. It stands in direct opposition to the core educational values of critical thinking and open discourse, values that bring us together for important discussions like this one that our Law Review has so wisely led. And for me, it is in some ways personally sad, because the introduction to critical race theory in law school really allowed me to see a place for myself in the legal profession when I was a law student. So as these mounting attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion grow, it's critical that we offer forums like this one where we can discuss how we might counter any attacks on diversity and to answer questions about how we can go about doing that. And that's precisely why the Boston University Law Review has brought us together to have this discussion. So I want to say thank you to the BU Law Review for its courage, for hosting this important symposium. I want to thank especially Editor-in-Chief Keenan Hunt Stone and Executive Editor Carolyn Ranero for their work to plan and organize this event, along with Professor and Associate Dean Jasmine Gonzales Rose, and the wonderful Elizabeth Clancy here as well. And of course, Professor Fleming, the advisor for the Law Review. I also want to say thank you to the faculty and scholars on our panel who've taken time to lend their expertise and engage in this important dialogue. Thank you to Professor and Associate Dean Jasmine Gonzales Rose, Professor Jonathan Feingold, and one of our visiting professors, Vinay Harpalani. So after today's panel, we'll move to the law auditorium where Professor Dr. Ibram Kendi and Dr. Kendi is the founder and director of the BU Center for Anti-Racist Research and the person who wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist. And we'll continue this conversation in a fireside chat format. So I hope that you enjoy this discussion. Thank you for having this discussion, and welcome. Enjoy.
Good afternoon. Thank you again for joining us on this rainy day. As Dean Onwuachi-Willig said, my name is Keenan Hunt Stone, and I am the Editor-in-Chief of the Boston University Law Review, and I'll also be moderating this first panel. And I really want to dive into it, but I also want to take a moment to just reiterate some quick thanks. Thank you again to Dean Onwuachi-Willig for all your support and participation in this event. Thank you to the Center for Anti-Racist Research for co-sponsoring this event. In particular, thanks to Associate Dean Gonzales Rose for really being with us since this event's inception. A huge thank you to Elizabeth Clancy, without whom we wouldn't have this event or any law review event. Thank you to Professor Fleming for advising us through this. And then thank you to our executive editor, Carolyn Ranero, and our senior managing editor, Carolyn Grady, for all of their help behind the scenes for this. So this first question I have for the panel requires a little bit of background, so I hope you bear with me. But currently, an anonymous plaintiff is attempting a federal class action lawsuit against New York University, invoking Students for Fair Admissions. This John Doe plaintiff and his counsel, America First Legal, have attacked New York University Law Review's commitment to diversity as unlawful discrimination. The case is currently at the motion to dismiss stage, and what the plaintiff has pointed out is prior to Students for Fair Admissions, New York University Law Review had the following language on its membership page with regards to their use of personal statements. The information contained in these personal statements allows the Law Review to realize its commitment to staff diversity. The Law Review evaluates personal statements in light of various factors, including but not limited to race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, national origin, religion, socioeconomic background, ideological viewpoint, disability, and age. With regard to these and other aspects of diversity, applicants should clearly identify and discuss any personal characteristics, background, unique experiences, or qualifications that the applicant would like to bring to the attention of the selection committee. Post Students for Fair Admissions, this language has been removed, but post Students for Fair Admissions, it seems to be an appropriate time for law schools and law reviews to reaffirm their commitment to diversity. So my questions are, how should these organizations be treating language around diversity after Students for Fair Admissions and with the possibility of new lawsuits arising? And is removing diversity language entirely still a win for this plaintiff, even if they don't prevail at the motion to dismiss stage? And we'll go down the row here, starting with Professor Feingold.
Hey everybody, is this on? Yeah, no?
I'll get it.
Says it's on. No? Can you guys say? Hey everybody. No? All right. I'll just speak loudly. I don't like mics either. I want to start by thanking Keenan and the Law Review and the Dean, Carolyn, everyone for putting this on. Professor Fleming, Associate Dean Gonzales Rose. It is hard to imagine a more important conversation for law schools to be having right now than the ongoing consequences of an ever-growing, well-funded, highly coordinated effort to erode the civil rights infrastructure in the country. And so I'm going to sort of respond to Keenan's comment, sort of not, or question, sort of not, in part because we have almost no time to talk right now. And so I want to just say a little bit about the stakes. I want to say something really specific to law students right now and law reviews right now. And then maybe I'll say just a little bit about just litigation. So the stakes. The stakes are not words on a law review webpage or a policy. So America First, this is Stephen Miller's legal shop. And created by everything that Stephen Miller publicly says that I don't need to repeat here. You can Google Stephen Miller if you don't know Stephen Miller. One of his goals would be to outlaw entities like LAWSO. And I'm thinking about LAWSO because I was at their annual event last night, which was important in all sorts of ways, but it is the sort of entity that BU cannot function without. It's not peripheral, it's critical for all sorts of reasons, including an institution like BU being able to realize the basic mission of the ABA and to undergird a commitment to a truly, at least aspirationally, multiracial democracy. So, and the stakes, like, really we're talking about a moment in which you have decades of right-wing networks that have been organizing and now have a Supreme Court that is on board. So those are the stakes. Second is about law students and law reviews. You have to start lawyering. And I mean that not in the, so as a aside, footnote, I'm often very critical how we as the legal profession talk about thinking like a lawyer. Because I think generally thinking like a lawyer is this very narrow, shallow thing. So when I say lawyering now, I mean it quite capaciously. You have to be strategic. You have to understand where you hold power. You've got to understand what are the risks, and you should act and employ the sophisticated legal analysis that you have. So if the question is, does SFFA prohibit BU's law review or NYU's law review from doing X? Don't ask me. Read SFFA and then tell me. And certainly don't listen to Stephen Miller. And if you get a letter from Ed Bloom, you can, in contracts we call it puffery, what is it? What's the word? When you're making it up, just making stuff up. So one thing that Gary Lawson, who's a colleague of mine, ideologically, we do not overlap much, but I increasingly say the stuff Gary says, which I don't know what that means. One thing that he has reminded me at times, and is important for us all to remember, is often we are not fighting about the law. We're not fighting about the 14th Amendment or Title VI. We're fighting over the case. And right now the fight is over what does SFFA mean? And we, at least anyone who is with me, we are losing the public narrative with respect to what SFFA means. I'm not actually going to talk about it. You read it, and then tell me what it means. The last sort of thing about lawyering. you do not need to ask for permission. You should consult with colleagues, allies, collaborators, better understand the sort of complexities that institutions have to navigate. But we legal academia, education, law schools, do students often a disservice by sort of engaging in this weird infantilization that happens. Just remember, this high school and college organizing outfit in Georgia Youth Justice Coalition put it, no one is coming to save us. And so we are all relying on you as much as you might think you're relying on us.
Professor Harpalani.
Thank you. Let's see if my mic is on. Okay, seems like it is. One of the unique things about law reviews is that unlike journals in other disciplines, they are student-led. Students work on law reviews, and I think that's a great thing. I think law review itself is a great opportunity. Being on a journal, I think is, for me, I was on the NYU Law Review actually. I went to NYU Law School. It was one of the best parts of my legal education. And when I was on there, we had diversity as part of the selection process. Also, I was involved on the diversity committee in terms of selecting people for law review. I can't remember what our language was on the website, what it mentioned. It had the word diversity, that's all I remember. But it didn't really matter that much because what we found was, and this goes to just building things from the ground up, we didn't have a lot of interest from a lot of students of color. They weren't applying to be on the law review. They weren't partaking in the competition. What we had to do was actually go and generate that interest. We went to the different student of color organizations. I used to go to the, I was there for a little while. I used to go to the BALSA meetings and talk about being on law review. I tried to, when they had the elections, I would ask the people running for president, will you support the statement that every student in BALSA should apply to be on a journal? And they would they supported it in spirit, but they didn't want to say, you know how people feel about journals, especially the 2L year and being the staff editor and all. But, we really had to harp home what the advantages of being on a journal were. Really build it from the ground up on law review. The students who did come on, the students of color, weren't really seeking leadership positions. I think there's a kind of culture around law reviews and journals also that needed to change. But it's up to students to be proactive to change that. I think, institutions can impart certain values. I think what BU Law has done here under Dean Onwuachi-Willig is wonderful in many ways. But this stuff happens from the ground up. Just remember how students of color got to institutions of higher education. It was through students protesting. It was through taking over buildings. It was through student activism. That has always been the genesis of this. So, we have these attacks on DEI initiatives, and we want to, have institutions support these DEI initiatives. But at the end of the day, remember, the reason we have these DEI initiatives is because of student activism. It's still up to the students, even when you have a wonderful dean administration like we have here. Students have to do this. Now, in the NYU Law Review, I was a mentor for a few of the students of colors, and one of my mentees, she became the editor-in-chief the following year. She was the second black woman to become the editor-in-chief. And we tried to start kind of an institutional culture there also. I think this is the early 2010s, 2009, 10, 11, 12. For about 5 straight years, we had a person of color who was the editor-in-chief of the NYU Law Review. And that was just kind of through a whole institutional socialization process. Each class tried to make an effort to make sure the next class would be really engaged on law review. So we tried to institutionalize this, but those things always do change over time, unfortunately. I think, you have a leader, you have editor-in-chief or a dean of a law school who puts these practices in place, but institutions, tend to erode over time. And it's important for every generation of students to be active on these issues, to make sure that you're doing your part also in these organizations to make sure that DEI initiatives are being protected, even if they're there. And that's also a counter to all of these attacks. So I would just say, I think the language on the website, I mean, it's great to have language there that's clear, but that's not the most important issue. The most important issue is what you do on the ground, and always keep that in mind.
So I have a 9-year-old, and when he was 8 years old, last Halloween, he went and got candy trick-or-treating and got some really like junky candy with all these, I don't know, additives and colors and all of this that was not good for him, ate it, and then I made a rule. And I said, you know what, you can't eat that. Do you think he interpreted that to mean he can't eat anything that is sweet? No. He was only 8, but he understood a little bit about being a lawyer, which is understanding the limitations. Really, okay, so Mom, you said I can't eat that one, but I can eat all these others, right? So we have an anonymous plaintiff bringing a lawsuit. Do you know how many lawsuits and claims that a university faces? There's a lot. If there's some complaint in the cafeteria, do they go and change to have more ketchup or mustard? I mean, one of the things I hope that we've taught you here is to not be reactionary, right? To be analytical, to be rooted in our collective values. And so I think that it's very problematic to read something like SFFA that broadly. Sure, there is going to be criticism. There's criticism all the time. And so I really want us to not do the work of those who seek to subordinate us.
If any panelists have a response to anything that was said, you have a few minutes before we move to this question.
I would just wholeheartedly second the point about not in whatever case, why would you let your adversary overread an opinion? And why would you cave just because you get a demand letter with an overread opinion? A lot of universities have engaged in ways that I think one could characterize as caving to overbroad demand letters. And a different question we should ask is why? And we don't have time to get into it, but that's another question about being a lawyer and understanding how institutions work and what are the priorities of a place like a Harvard or a BU or a UNC, and why do institutions seem to backpedal in some cases and not others? Those are not necessarily easy answers, but those are questions that we need to take seriously if we want to understand why institutions are acting the way they do, and if we don't think they should be acting that way, how we might be able to change them. And the other thing is the power that law reviews have is pretty tremendous, not just with respect to being sort of pipelines of access for the law review for the law students, but for faculty individually and collectively driving conversations. There's certainly nothing in SFFA that says BU Law Review can't have conversations about what it wants to be having all the time. On the other hand, and now I know I'm going longer than you wanted when you invited it, law reviews are far more vulnerable, and the students on law reviews are far more vulnerable when you are not working collectively across law reviews. It's probably not news to anyone that some of the most powerful law firms in the country directly targeted law students or indirectly, and made very clear that if you engage in certain forms of speech, you might not be welcome here. That's incredibly scary for law students, and we should recognize that. And one question is, how should Legal Academy, how should the ABA be responding? Another question is, what could law reviews be doing collectively to better insulate themselves from external interference and also do the work that they want to do? And again, I'm not suggesting I have answers to those questions, but I think those are really important questions, and it's ones that are probably all gonna will all be better positioned when we are collectively engaged.
Thank you, all panelists, for your thoughts on that. I'm going to move on to say, in addition to these attacks on admissions, as Dean Onwuachi-Willig pointed out in her opening, we have also seen attacks on curricula. And so starting with this Trump administration executive order that had the idea of banning what they refer to as divisive concepts, we've seen this idea of removing divisive concepts appear in state legislatures, gubernatorial agendas, school board meetings. So what is the appropriate counter to this framing of things like CRT, things like anti-racist practices as being divisive? And again, we'll start with Professor Feingold.
Oh, I'll defer this time if anyone else wants to jump in first.
I could
Yeah,
jump
go
in.
ahead.
So it's really interesting when you work in this little nuanced field, right, that hardly anyone knows about outside of law schools. Some education schools know about critical race theory. And then suddenly you're on a bus someplace and someone has like an anti-CRT. I mean, imagine you're like some little archaic field in philosophy or something, and then people are like against your field. What happened here? And what's so interesting here is that we have, for instance, a political activist, Chris Rufo, who is a questionable journalist. I mean, he has headlines like California schools, you know, children learn to worship these like cannibalistic gods and stuff. And I'm like, whoa, my son would be so much more engaged if that were right? You're hearing a lot about him today, I guess. And, you know, he goes on, you know, the Tucker Carlson show or something, and he, in early 2020, and he says, look, CRT is this existential threat to the core values of the United States. The president has the power to issue an executive order. Very next day, we have chief of staff to Trump, Mr. Meadows, who calls him up. Very quickly, he gets to the White House. They draft this executive order, right, and have this targeted attack, which is very narrative-based. It is this idea that we are going to delegitimize, and you know, Rufo has said this, like anytime someone hears something crazy, they're going to think CRT, right? And it's a narrative attack, and it becomes a political attack, but it's not a intellectually engaged exercise. I think people should disagree with critical race theory. I happen to be very engaged with it. But you should criticize it based on an intellectual and engagement, not ban it. They're also saying things are critical race theory that aren't. And so in this idea of being divisive, I think it's actually really inclusive. I've had the opportunity to study from most of the great authors of critical race theory, I've realized, whether it was in an informal environment or a talk or reading their texts. And what I've seen is the most inclusive space where people of so many different backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives can come together and really engage. So being critical. What time is it that we need to be critical more than now? People believing these conspiracy theories and these just bizarre, not believing in science, it's time to be critical. And thinking about race, thinking about how do these social phenomena and constructions impact our everyday life, interrogating that, thinking about that. I have had some of the most powerful conversations in the last few months with people who identify as being Jewish, who are either identify as being white or white passing, who are often conservative. I've had these conversations where we're doing a critical race theory analysis of Jewish identity. And that's resonating, like, wow, I hadn't thought about that. I haven't thought about the cyclical nature of subordination, not having full access to the privileges of whiteness. And these are folks who are not aligned with critical race theory. I'm not saying people from that identity are not. I'm just saying I happen to have conversations with people. And it's been like, wow, this is so useful, right? And then theorizing the human experience of voices and people who are so often overlooked and having a language to articulate that. And once you have a language, right, once you have that sort of epistemic justice, you can then translate that into protections, and you can translate that into unifying concepts of organizing. And that's what we saw in 2020 when that language from critical race theory texts were then discourse on the streets, in the homes, and that's where we then saw a lot of subsequent pushback because it's so powerful. Critical race theory is so often really a unifying concept that is including more people, not a divisive concept.
I mean, I can echo everything that was just said. As I mentioned earlier, I went to NYU School of Law. I worked very closely with Professor Derek Bell, who is considered to be one of the founders of critical race theory. He used to tell a lot of different stories. He used to talk about, when people ask him, what is critical race theory? His response was, I don't know what that is. To me, it just means telling the truth, even in the face of criticism. He wrote a book called Confronting Authority. He wanted his students to learn how to confront authority, including his own authority. So he would go up in front of the classroom, share his views, they might be controversial to some people, invite students to respond to him. And there were conservative students who responded to them. And, they had a dialogue. He hired some of them as his teaching assistants in the future. Critical race theory is really about telling your own story, your own perspective. It is inclusive. And for people of color, that is a story of, talking about our own experiences, with racism, with a lot of different things. So it is an inclusive perspective in that way, and that goes back right to its founding. Now, Professor Gonzales Rose was talking about kind of the narrative around the attacks on critical race theory and how, Christopher Rufo, really distorts the meaning of critical race theory, but is aware that he's creating a certain narrative, and really is open about that. Has talked about, he was talking about everything that happened with Harvard's president having to resign. And he talked about this. He said, I knew I had to get the white conservatives on board. They were on board. But the way to really make this happen, to accomplish his goals, was to get white liberals to oppose DEI initiatives. And I'm like, Christopher Rufo is a critical race theorist. He's talking about narrative. Professor Bell used to talk about, white liberals and going back to serving two masters and stuff. So, he knows how real this stuff is. He's using it as he's criticizing it. But I think, how to respond to all this, I'll go back to my earlier comment about student activism. I think the reason we have critical race theory, the reason we have all of these initiatives at schools is because students demanded them. John talked about institutions and their kind of ambivalent commitment to all of these things. But students pushed institutions to create these institutions. And I think, in the wake of all of these different laws that are being passed, it's number one, it's up to student activism. But number two, also, I'll say this, we might have some interesting allies in some of these fights also, because they are about free speech, First Amendment issues. So, libertarians who sometimes defend, hate speech, other things, should also be on board with defending teaching critical race theory. And we have to make strategic coalitions where we can. We may agree with people on certain issues and disagree, but when we are on the same side, that's part of the strategic, I think the strategy that Professor Feingold also mentioned, use that, always think strategically in that vein.
Just finally, we can take a minute or two, and then we'll open up to questions after.
Yes, so I guess a minute or two, and I'll keep it to a minute or two. So one is that, I think it's right to identify Christopher Rufo as the public face of sort of ongoing campaign to smear everything sort of that is sort of inclusionary, progressive, anti-racist sort of value or commitment, but he is underwritten by tremendous power and resources, think tanks, donors, and so he is platformed in a way that many aren't. And so I don't want us to overcredit him or suggest that this is like some lone wolf operation. perhaps predictably effective at turning critical race theory, now DEI, diversity, to slurs. And that's what he's done. And it's part of something that's important to see. It's part of a broader project of preventing us as a society from taking seriously the notion that racism is structural. Because that's what everyone, for, I don't know, 27 days in the summer of 2020, everyone finally agreed. It's like, okay, yeah, we get it, this thing, racism, it's structural, it's everywhere, unless we are affirmatively intervening, interrupting it, it's going to do all this bad stuff. And then when you recognize racism is structural, all the other stuff, like something like DEI, like LALSA, it's not just extra, it is essential. Because unless you have it, you actually cannot get to multiracial democracy. But part of the move of turning, or one of the ways that you get to turning these like banal terms into slurs is also by essentially emptying out any meaning to structural racism. You prevent us from being able to talk about it, from being able to, and then if there is no structural racism, then that sort of leads to the logical conclusion that, well, maybe there's, and this is like sort of the DeSantis move. I mean, there's inequality, but isn't that just like a product of a neutral market? And so it's important to see how all of this is interrelated. The last thing, do I have 10 more seconds?
You're 10 seconds over.
Okay.
But you can take it.
So lawyering. There's all these bills across the country, these copycat bills, often tracing to Trump's executive order from the summer of 2020, that we have publicly internalized as quote-unquote anti-CRT bills. Many of them don't name CRT. A lot of them include this banal sort of anti-discrimination language. Like, you may not compel a student to believe that one race or ethnic group is morally superior to another. I think that means that if you're a teacher in Florida, the state is sort of suggesting that it's important for you to say that you think that Palestinian students deserve equal treatment. And like, that's not what DeSantis wants you to say. Or you might say that actually I think we should take implicit bias seriously, because if we don't, then it might suggest that one group is morally superior to the other. So the point is that we should be lawyering this, because when we don't, then we internalize the notion that these laws maybe on their face do more than they do, but then it also enables the DeSantis's to harden this conceptual link between stuff like critical race theory and racism, which again is the move, to turn the anti-racists into the racists.
Thanks to all our panelists. At this point, with our last 5 minutes, we'd like to open up to questions. Professor Wheeler.
Hello, panel. I apologize for my lateness. I spent the last, 4 or 5 days at Penn Law, which is the law school formerly known as University of Pennsylvania Law School, and I had the, I say this with much irony, the pleasure of speaking face to face with Amy Wax. And if you don't know who that is, Google Amy Wax. Believe it or not. And what became apparent beyond her collegial tone, but a very perceptible sneer that with which she glared at me during our conversation, was that people of her ilk are really good at using critical race theory, First Amendment, and all of the tools in the toolbox that were formerly tools of the left. They have operationalized those very effectively for the right. And I shouldn't use terms like left or right, but you know what I mean. And I wonder if the panelists could comment on how we can prevent, or how we can disrupt our opponents from using our strategies to their
I could just have a couple of, for me, CRT and teaching CRT, wasn't necessarily a political endeavor, and I always found was helpful to all students. And so students who identified as being conservative, libertarian, often really engaged with the work, and I thought that was fantastic. What I think is that we're seeing this disingenuous approach where we're violating really our fundamental values. And a lot of these values are like academic freedom, freedom of speech and expression, democracy, evidence-based science. I mean, these sort of things. So to me, we just need to really focus back on some of these collective values that are so important. And politically, we may differ a lot, but we need to get back to these fundamental principles that are fundamental to our profession of being lawyers, irrespective of our political leanings. And so to me, that's really what it's about, and calling back to that reality.
So one thing that I think is important for law students to appreciate, you do, but all this language is indeterminate. Like equality doesn't mean anything in itself, but there's tremendous political power that comes from being able to own the term. If your side is associated with the side of equality, then there's a lot of moral ground that you can marshal. And so I think part of just the first step is recognizing that no one owns these terms. The terms, they're just words, but they're connected to broader social understanding. And after the in the wake of the civil rights movement, entities, organizations that were far more comfortable with the prevailing racial order, they recognized that the country had shifted in some ways, and in order to either maintain or regain some of that, rigid, sort of hierarchical society meant taking the language and co-opting it. And then there's another sort of reflection. So Professor Harpalani mentioned that the libertarian, sort of the hard academic freedom flank should be available to collaborate with folks who maybe often are on the quote-unquote other side in these moments when there's just unbridled attacks on tenure, academic freedom, institutional independence. No one came to CRT's defense. No one came.
Wow. Well, I was actually once on a panel with Amy Wax also at the University of Pennsylvania. It was, it was Amy Wax. It was the then, I think, Solicitor General of Texas, who later became a Trump lawyer. And then there was a tenured, very liberal law professor and me. So I let them go at it and just, said my own little thing. Just let them deal with all of that. But I think, your point is well taken. I mean, all these tools that, we develop as, progressives are being co-opted. Even in, you look at SFFA, the whole social construction of race, fundamental critical race theory concept, and now you say, well, racial categories don't make sense, therefore we have to be colorblind. I think just the whole impact litigation model that SFFA is using, go back to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, it was progressives who kind of even created this model. What do you do about it? I don't know, I don't know the answer to that question. I think this is a process you see throughout history where these types of tools and methods are co-opted and used for different ends. And it's just kind of an existential struggle. I think, but what always happens is, we rebuild, we come up with something different. And that's how progress happens. And that's why, from the beginning I talked about student activism. That's how DEI initiatives, anti-racism came to be. And came to be at, in higher education on campuses. So unfortunately, I don't think we can stop it. I think it's an existential struggle, but it's about, it's about rebirth. It's about continually knowing that we are part of the struggle, never being complacent about that. And it's about every generation, I emphasize students, every generation of students taking your own initiative to create something that, can be passed on in the future. Even if eventually, it may be withered down or co-opted, but that's why we've got to keep going.
I think we're at time, but let's field one more question if our panelists are okay.
Yes. So my question centers around mostly, building off the point Jasmine raised about approaching these matters intellectually. One of the things that I've kind of been struggling with, both with talking with peers, students, and even family members on a lot of different things, is approaching these things against people that are arguing and knowingly arguing with me in bad faith. So it's one of those things that I've seen this happen multiple times where I will have citations, I have resources, I have studies, I will point these things out. There's been more, I think one of the phrases I've heard a lot in the last few years thrown at me is liberal elitist stooge, and the fact that I walked away in an ivory tower that has no bearing on the average day-to-day lives of people. And it's kind of even things I run into with family members that people will complain about something, all look at what they're complaining about, and like, oh, here's what the actual thing says, and here's what that would really generally mean. But I find more often than not, especially with a lot of these topics, that falls on deaf ears, and it's not a place that, approaching it from an intellectual angle, I'm not really finding any kind of grounding. So I'm kind of wondering how we go about facing that when we're trying to approach things from that level, but oftentimes in this current environment, we're being looked at as though we're looking down on someone and saying, I'm better than you, because of the fact that we're leveraging this from that research standpoint.
I think there's a real attack on learning, on anti-intellectualism and so forth, generally. But also, I mean, some of these movements happened without the terminology. If we can really go to the values, if we can really go, and that, to me, I think critical race theory, I think that anti-racism, I think anti-subordination, it's about love. It's about love, and that's something we can share, right? We can loving our siblings, right? Loving our neighbors, and that's something I really try to reach people at, and have these conversations are really about these values, and then we can go from there.
So thanks again for the question. One is Randall Kennedy did come to CRT's defense.
He did?
I can put that on the record.
He did?
Maybe he was the only one. So I think there's a lot of people written really great stuff on how to engage propaganda, which I'm not an expert in, but we should all be reading up on. But for me, I take the classroom really, I think of it as a sacred space. And one thing that I think we all need to be doing now is figuring out how we can maintain the classroom and the university, though there's different spaces in the university, but the classroom as a place where, whatever our priors, we're deeply committed to solving really hard problems. And we are as intellectually honest as we can be, and recognize the moments. And because I think where we are, where this is all happening, is going to be a different answer. But at least in the classroom, there has to be something different about what we are doing collectively here than out there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, critical race theory started with the experiences, on-the-ground experiences of people of color. Derek Bell was writing about what he experienced out in the community, as a lawyer, but also meeting with parents right here in Boston, right, during the school desegregation and kind of the, tensions the parents felt about, do we really, these are black parents, do we really want our kids going to, be bused, going to these desegregated schools, when we know there's all this racial tension that they're facing. This is a very, very real experience that he was dealing with. And, he wrote his classic article, Serving Two Masters, in response to that experience. It was very tangible. I think, kind of the academic language, all of that kind of comes later. That's something when you're writing an article, in academia, and when you're trying to generalize across situations, you create theoretical framework, and, that's part of the whole, that's part of the whole academic process. And it's an important part, but, I want us to remember where this all started. It started with the tangible experiences, which is where you can relate more to people on the ground. And I think, when we're communicating, we got to keep that in mind. What we do to get tenure advanced in academia is different than what we do to, communicate out in the community. And we go back to those experiences that got us started.
I'd like to thank our panelists one last time.
Thank you for sticking with us and for joining us for this second conversation. I'm very excited for. I want to thank Dean Angela Onwuachi-Willig once again, and we're looking forward to her leading this conversation with Dr. Kendi, and thank you to Dr. Kendi for being with us and for your time today. Dr. Ibram X. Kendi is a National Book Award winning and #1 New York Times bestselling bestselling author of 5 books for adults and 3 books for children. Professor Kendi is a contributor, writer at The Atlantic, and a CBS News racial justice contributor. He's also the founder of the BU Anti-Racist Research Center. Professor Kendi is the author of The Black Campus Movement and Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, which won the National Book Award for Nonfiction in 2016. Professor Kendi has also produced 5 #1 New York Times bestsellers, including How to Be an Anti-Racist and 400 Souls. He's written and published a number of academic essays and was a visiting professor at Brown University, a 2013 National Academy of Education Spencer Postdoctoral Fellow, and a 2021 MacArthur Fellow. So we're so excited for this conversation, which is going to discuss countering attacks on diversity. So thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. And because of so much of how we understand race and racism is shaped by our experiences, which is also shaped by our many identities, by how and where we grew up, by our histories, and by the education we received, at both formal and informal, I thought it'd be really nice to start off with a few questions that allow the audience to simply get to know you. So, so first, can you tell us about the very first time you recognized that you had a race? And by that I mean, when did you first realize that you were racialized as Black, and what is your first memory of race affecting your life?
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I'm so glad to be a part of this symposium. I'm so glad to be in conversation, with you. I just want to thank you for your leadership, of this law school and your partnership as it relates to anti-racism. I think when I was 7 years old, I believe, my parents and I went to visit a school, and I believe for 3rd grade, if I'm remembering correctly, and I noticed as we were walking through the school that pretty much all of the students were Black and all of the teachers were white. And the teacher who was escorting us through the school, who was escorting us to her classroom, was Black. And, I remember after she gave us her spiel, on the school, on the curriculum, and I was witnessing my parents sort of engage with her, I asked her, are you the only Black teacher at this school? And then I proceeded to cut her off and ask her, why are you the only Black teacher, at this school? And I think according to my parents and even personally, that was my first memory of my own racialization, and even potentially how even the recognition, of that disparity really was my first sort of conceptual recognition of a disparity of all these Black students being taught by all these white teachers.
Why do you think that was meaningful to the young 7-year-old Ibram? Why do you think you noticed that? What was it about?
I think my suspicion is that I was at a school that was predominantly Black with a predominantly Black teaching force. And so I had become used to having Black teachers. And I also think my parents brought me along because they wanted, I think they specifically was like, tell us what you think. So I was like, okay, I'm going to tell you what I think. So they invited me to critically analyze the school as we were experiencing.
So, what brought you to do work on anti-racism? Like, what is it that motivates you? How did you find yourself being the leading voice on anti-racism in the country?
It's been a journey. I think I actually initially was, when I went to college, I was initially interested in being a sports reporter. And I was a journalism major at first. But then I think I started to do internships. I started to meet professional athletes. I started to realize that they're just like any of us. So it got old very quickly, so to speak. And I remember, I believe my junior year, I did a story I interviewed many of the top high school football recruits in the Southeast to inquire whether they would prefer to play for a black head football coach. These were black recruits. At the time, the SEC had never hired a black head football coach. Most of these players said that they would prefer to play for a black head football coach. I published that story. It became quite, there was a lot of conversation around it. And I saw sort of the impact of that story, even through sort of conversation and arguing that had never happened for like reporting on a minor league baseball game, as an example. And I think that was really my introduction. So it was like first sports, then sports and race. And then eventually I started to want to write on and ultimately research race and racism.
It's so fascinating what you're talking about, your experience. I mean, you're much younger than I am, but I was, when I was growing up, and I grew up in Houston, Texas, I had a number of black teachers, and I always pointed that when I was in elementary school and middle school, and I always pointed that as something that was really important, right? Because here were people that I saw who were living kind of a middle class life, who were, who had their own education, and to see that was really, really important. And I compare that to my own kids' experiences, which is completely the opposite. And I'm curious to know about our students. How many of you had black teachers before you went to college? Yeah. And how many people then when you went to college had one?
I had one.
One. Yeah. So it's just really, it's a really turn at it. For me, I think it's a turn in terms of generational experience. And education is so, so important, right? We know education is important for a variety of reasons. You get exposed to different kinds of people, depending upon the school that you go to. You get exposed to different ideas. And of course, as this symposium in the Boston University Law Review has made clear, they're examining attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the classroom, on campuses across the nation. And I'm curious to know, can you share an experience you had with a teacher or an educational moment in your own personal history that has deeply influenced you as we talk about education and why the attack on education is so critical?
So I think I mentioned how when I was in college, I became more and more interested in writing on race and racism, initially sports and race. And at that moment, I decided to take an African American history course by Professor David Jackson, at FAMU, where I went to undergrad. And what was striking, first and foremost, about his course was the seriousness, the sort of seriousness of the intellectual environment that he created. And that then, for me, conveyed to me the seriousness of this intellectual endeavor. But it was also striking to me because I think it was the first time through systematically studying African American history that I begin to understand the structure of racism. I think before that, I had imagined the, quote, racial battle as between groups. White people battling against black people. It really wasn't until that course that I began to really unpack the structural sort of nature of, of the problems that I had personally faced and others, had faced. And that just completely blew my mind, right? And really transformed my awareness of society and even myself.
It's so important, I think, because so many of us grow up in elementary school being told about racism as being only attitudinal. It's only about whether people hate you because of, and gets defined as skin color, race gets defined as skin color or your skin color, and then having a broader lens into understanding the structural dynamics of racism, right? And the way it's built into so many different structures is so critical and so eye-opening. And I can imagine that a lot of students out here also had that experience.
And if I can just say, I think even I wrote about this in How to Be an Anti-Racist, that in many ways I came of age thinking that having internalized the idea that the problem was Black people. And then by the time I got to college, I started to think, well, maybe it wasn't Black people that were only the problem, that white people were the problem too. And so it really wasn't until that class, and really I actually took a major in African American studies, that I understood the problem was the structure of racism. And that in a way I had been convinced or taught that the problem, was people.
Yeah. So Professor Feingold mentioned earlier that people had a kind of an awakening for 20 days. I think you said 20 days. 27 days to structural racism. And so I want to like set some context and talk a little bit about the moment that we're in now. So almost 4 years ago, we had the horrific murder of George Floyd by former officer Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis. And we seem to be experiencing a meaningful shift in terms of our national understanding of racism at that time. So the New York Times reported in 2020 that large numbers of white and highly educated people were not only joining protests against police brutality and racism, but they were also, quote, going through a wave of self-examination, buying books about racism, talking to Black friends, and arguing within their own families, end quote. So there seemed to be, in some ways, an awakening to racism, a greater understanding of racism as being beyond attitudes and to be structural racism. And the racial equality protests of summer 2020 were really distinct from so many different protests before. They were the largest protests ever in our nation. They were multicultural, and in some cities they were even majority white. And this was like widely written about, that this was really, really a turning point in our country, right? So a CNN article made clear that there were not only protests in cities with meaningful Black populations like Atlanta, like Detroit, but also in largely white enclaves like Prairieville, Kansas, Northfield, Minnesota, Portland, Oregon. Also, nearly $50 billion was pledged by corporations, pledged to give to support Black communities and to fight racism. Now, I want to make clear, mind you, that only $4.2 billion of that $50 million has even been spent in that way, and only $70 million of that $4.2 million was $4.50 billion, $4.2 billion, and only $70 million of that $4.2 billion was grant money, as opposed to mostly loans, things that corporations would actually end up profiting from. But still, it was really important. But here were companies openly, for the first time, saying they were pledging money towards fighting racism. But just a few months later, I believe as Keenan pointed out, it began at the top with our former President Donald Trump, who may become president again, issuing an executive order that banned different types of diversity training for federal employees. And he came up with these 8 divisive concepts that would restrict lessons on race and racism. So how do we get from having the largest protests ever, the most multicultural protests ever, this awakening to racism, at least structural racism, for 27 days, I think as Professor Feingold said, to the point where we are now, where there's really a full-fledged attack against anti-racism, against DEI, against critical race theory, against so many things that I think are really critical to responding to the backlash and the retrenchment in our country.
Well, I think the way we got to this point is unfortunately, in many, though not completely, history was repeated, right? How did we get to a place in 1871 where we had these sort of Reconstruction governments that were largely headed by formerly enslaved Black people and working class white people that were creating the South's first free public schools, that were creating the South's first asylums for people with mental disabilities, that were reducing all of the laws that enslavers had used to criminalize poverty, and on. How did we get to that point, to 1895, where particularly Black people and many poor whites had been almost completely disenfranchised? Well, what the conservators of racism, the narrative that they used was that these first multiracial governments were Black governments, and that those Black governments were anti-white. And that those governments actually hadn't benefited the vast majority of Southerners who were primarily white, they'd actually harmed them. And similarly, by the late 1960s and early 1970s, those who were trying to conserve racism were framing anti-racist and equitable efforts as a form of reverse discrimination. Again, as harmful to white people. And just as today, we have people who are still using this old line that to be anti-racist is to be anti-white. And I think part of the reason why these narrative efforts have been successful, and of course these efforts are used to justify the retrenchment of those new practices and policies and efforts we created or we're striving to create. One of the reasons why I think these efforts have been successful continuously is because there's not only a massive amounts of ignorance about the history of peoples of color, but there's also a massive amount of ignorance about white American history. Like, if you teach white Americans that enslavers were good for them, right, and that's the history that they've learned, right? If you teach them it was a lost cause, the Civil War enslaved them, it was a war of northern aggression against their rights, then they're not going to know the history that's told in books like Masterless Men. This is a book that describes the ways in which white enslavers were able to almost completely dominate the non-enslaving white South, or the ways in which poll taxes weren't just used to disenfranchise Black people, but they also disenfranchised a vast majority of white Southerners. And so I think because white Americans don't know their own history, because they assume the zero-sum lie that as things get better for people of color, things get worse for them, it causes them to be easily hoodwinked and manipulated, into believing these equitable efforts, are going to harm them. And what was fascinating also about 2020 was, I think it was early June, the first week of June, when Donald Trump tweeted about an incident that happened in Buffalo, New York. And at the same time, at the end of June, Donald Trump would respond to a question. I think someone asked him, a CBS reporter asked him, why are so many Black people dying of police violence? And his response was, white people are dying too. What about white people? So are white people. I'm mentioning this because in Buffalo, New York, there was a demonstration against police violence during the first week, and a 75-year-old white male approached a police officer, and that police officer and another police officer shoved him to the ground, knocked him out, he had to be hospitalized. And then Trump tweeted that he must be Antifa. So he didn't even seek to defend. There was a white person who was brutalized by the police, and the so-called pro-white president didn't even seek to defend him. But again, I don't think people necessarily saw that, right? Understood the implications of that. And so I think that's part of the problem, right? That in many ways, white Americans, particularly the vast majority of white Americans, don't understand their own history. And similarly, you have many people of color who haven't been taught their own history. They think that the way in which we've been able to create more equity and justice, in this country hasn't been through struggle, hasn't been through organizing and resistance and challenging and demanding. That we've been taught this history that we persuaded Abraham Lincoln to free Black people, right? That Congress realized Jim Crow was wrong, particularly white congressmen, and that's why they decided to pass the Civil Rights Bill. So even people of color have been taught this history that actually isn't reflective of reality.
Yeah, because there's so much packed in what you said. I think I love what you said about going back to the Reconstruction period and how the narrative has really it's changed slightly over time. It's morphed slightly over time, but it's the same thing that I think a lot of people don't realize that very, very soon after the end of the Civil War, you were seeing even in Supreme Court cases, the court saying that Black people need to stop being the special favorites of the law, right? That just, like 4 or 5 years after the end of the Civil War, and that narrative is already developing and come back.
And Black folk were like, we would love to be the special favorites.
Yes, there's just so much richness in it. One of the things I think that's so interesting about the summer 2020 is, or you can tell me how you're thinking about it and what you said. So you have not only the most multicultural protests, a lot of majority white protests, people ranging in age from 19 to 75, right? Perhaps a broad range of ages. People are really beginning to see things and take action in this period. And one of the things that I think also happened is it was a scary moment, because there haven't been that many moments. The last time we had that really happening was probably in the midst of the civil rights movement, where you had a lot of white college students going down to the South, right, to engage in many of the protests and sit-ins and a variety of other things there. And it seems to me like one of the things is people were really scared. Here was this coalition, multiracial coalition, really having an impact in a lot of different cities. So you saw some changes in cities that I think we wouldn't have expected to see, at least I didn't expect to see in my own lifetime. And then that's what it seems, of course, like the anti-CRT, a variety of narratives develop in particular about this. One of the things I think is different about this generation, I'm always surprised as when I was teaching, is that they seem to have a language, even though they haven't been taught the fuller histories, I think, as you pointed out. They seem to have been exposed to some ideas that we weren't exposed to much later. My students, when I was teaching, came in with an understanding of intersectionality, of a variety of different kinds of concepts. The structural racism, they at least even knew the word, whereas I don't think it was much later when I learned the word. And I found that was really scary for people. And so then it becomes this attack on things like CRT. And I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think that is playing any kind of role in it? In particular, why do you think educational institutions became a target for people who were really seeking to put us back into this moment of retrenchment?
So I think the reason is because historically, again, I'm just biased because I'm an historian. Thank y'all in law for letting me hang out a little bit. I think when we look at, again, particularly American history, but this is even the case in other countries, when these folks who are seeking to particularly generate white fear, they specifically wield and manipulate white women and children. And increasingly, it's children. So obviously, as we know here in Boston, the narrative around the way in which what white children are going to experience if their school is desegregated was utilized to generate and organize and more so mobilize white opposition to not only busing, but busing was just sort of, but more so desegregation and anti-racist policies more broadly. And again, it was very simple, right? That you know, in the Reconstruction and certainly in the early 20th century, if you empower black men with the vote, they're going to, quote, rape white women. Like that was the line, that was the idea. And similarly, in recent decades, right, if white children are exposed to peoples of color, they're going to be harmed. And in the 70s, they were going to be harmed by the bodies, and now they're going to be harmed by the ideas. And so to me, it's incredibly not only disingenuous, but it also demonstrates a complete lack of regard for children of color, like because it's as if they don't even exist. They're what it feels like for a Native child or a Black child or a Latinx child or an Asian child to be in a classroom where literature written by and about people like them is not existent or is marginal. What it feels like for that child is completely disregarded. And not only you know, that's completely disregarded, but even the white children who are constantly and routinely, particularly preteens, being exposed, if not directly targeted by white supremacist, anti-Semitic, transphobic, homophobic, sexist literature online, literally being recruited at 14, 13 years of age by white supremacist organizations, and they have no idea to even know that they're literally being targeted with those ideas because they've never been taught those ideas. So they can't identify those ideas. Then they get recruited into those organizations and their parents are like, what happened here? Right, and then their parents are too ashamed to even speak up about it, right? You know, and so, and we know that white supremacist organizations are the greatest domestic terrorist threat, you know, of our time. And so what I'm ultimately saying is, like, if we really think about it, they don't care about any of our children, right? You know, and just as you have more and more feminist scholars and historians who have made the case that the backside of the sort of lynching lie of the sort of black male lynchers was not just to sort of control the political activity of black communities, it was also to control the sexuality of white women. And so at the very moment that these people are apparently being protected, they're being controlled. And I think that's also what has historically happened. The very white groups that are utilized to generate white fear, what's actually happening is they're maximizing control over that very white group. At the same time, they're claiming to be freeing them.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and I think it shows the various ways in which different kinds of isms, intersectional isms as well, are really operating together to keep many different groups subordinated. So I guess one question I have before I move to another question is, like, why is it then the people that there aren't, I mean, you've explained it into more, why is it then that you don't see the kinds of coalitions that you would expect around the various different kinds of people of all different races, of all different genders, sexualities, gender identities that are being subordinated? So for example, even if you just looked at race alone, like what is it about that keeps those coalitions from forming?
Whew, okay. I think first and foremost that to build multiracial coalitions requires each of those racial groups to confront their own racist ideas about those other racial groups, right? So it's not just, oh, we're all gonna get along, but if I'm trying to build coalitions with, let's say, Asian Americans, and there's anti-Asianists operating within Black communities or even within myself, I have to confront that in order to build that coalition. And I think it can be difficult, for people, because particularly you have groups of color who can recognize the ways can recognize racist ideas about their own group, but it becomes much more difficult for them to confront and acknowledge the ways in which you may be trafficking, let's say, in anti-Blackness. And then when you add to, you say you can have Black men who can recognize racist ideas about Black people or even Black men, but they struggle to recognize racist ideas about Black women. So how can you build coalitions, or even women, sexist ideas about women in general? So how can you build coalitions with people in which you can't even recognize the sort of general forms of bigotry that are impacting them? And so I think that one of the reasons is because I think we're so focused on the bigotry that's affecting our own sort of racialized or gendered, or queer group, or even class group, and that's critically important. But we also have to interrogate our own ideas about other groups, because it prevents the type of solidarity that we need to be building. And then we also start playing oppression Olympics, right? Well, this is more important than that. And obviously that creates, or who's the most oppressed, which certainly is not a place to build sort of coalition. And then we're constantly divided and conquered by our enemies, who already know that we're struggling in these places. I'll stop there before I say something else.
Oh, you could totally say it. I'd love to hear. I really also really love one more thing you were talking about when you were talking about divisive concepts and how that was played out, and how it didn't account. Like, you could tell that children of color weren't really accounted for or cared for in that. And so it reminded me of one of the things Professor Feingold said in the last session, where he talked about the wording in these various statutes. And one of them was about, you can't teach people, basically you can't teach students things that might make them feel bad. And then you think about the one-sided, when you said that, it made me think about the one-sided nature of that. And who were they worried about feeling bad? Because also you can make kids feel bad about not hearing their own histories, or not hearing the full histories, as you pointed out, that even students of color are often not hearing about their group's contributions to the nation. I wanted to just highlight that because you said that. But so tell us, what can be done to overcome legal and political attacks in our nation, which is increasingly divided by politics? What role should educational institutions, places like BU, play in fighting against this type of racism?
Well, first, I don't think that we should abandon terms that have been sort of co-opted or even slandered and smeared. So we should not abandon the term critical race theory, because those have, and I also don't think we should abandon a term or a construct because it's become popular. And one of the things that I've noticed in the last, particularly the last 5 to 10 years, is each of these terms that become popular, whether it's anti-racist or critical race theory or Black Lives Matter, the more popular it becomes, there's a certain cynicism, particularly among people who imagine themselves as seeking to challenge racism, that, well, if it's popular, it must not be radical anymore, right? So, and it creates a situation in which, how do you build a social movement if you abandon anything that becomes popular, right? It's impossible. And so I think that, in a way, prevents us, right, from building sort of social movements. And I think that, I don't know necessarily whether that was something that happened in the past. And so I would just urge us to not abandon these terms. Even the term woke, like we should not abandon, that term. I would say secondly, that it is most critical in these moments for us to seek to climb into positions of power and to organize, and build institutions. Because when we really take a step back and think about what these efforts are trying to achieve, they're ultimately trying to destroy organizations and drive people who are committed to anti-racist work from power and replace them with who, right? People who are committed to conserving racism while they're empowering organizations, that are doing the same. And so that then gives us a blueprint of what we can't stop doing. And I think, again, all of the organizations who have been engaged in this type of work, the leaders who have been engaged in this type of work, have faced all sorts of smears and attacks and ways to sort of try to destroy them for a reason, right? And so we can't abandon these organizations. We can't abandon these leaders. We need to support them, that much more. And the final thing, that I would say is, it's important for us to understand that part of the reason for the intensity of the attacks is because of the success of the work, right? And we can't lose sight of that, right? I mentioned, for instance, those Reconstruction governments. They were being successful. That's why the attack and the violence was so withering, because of their success. So and so we just have to remind ourselves, because I think that in a way encourages us, right? Even at an individual level, right? I know my wife always tells me, shout out to the real Dr. Kendi, that that you're not doing anything if nobody's attacking you, right? Which sort of centers me when people make all sorts of interesting attacks, about me. And so, what if we responded to hate with, oh, you know what, I'm doing something. If these folks are coming at me and hating on me, that must mean I'm doing the work.
I love that. I'm really curious, because some people, I completely agree, we shouldn't abandon the terms, but in some states, literally educators, administrators are forced to abandon them. Their programs have been eliminated, and they're actually prohibited from saying words like diversity. So places like Florida, and I'm sure you and I both have friends who are talking about how are the ways that they're functioning without being able to say those words, with having departments like sociology attacked and erased, variety of different things. And then the other thing is, I would say, which I thought was really, really important that you said, Brian Stevenson always talked about, we won the Civil War, but we lost the narrative war. And a lot of the panelists in the last group were talking about the importance of the narrative. How do you win the narrative with the public? And so if we're reclaiming these words that you said, how do we use them? Would you have any suggestions for different ways that we use them in order to win the narrative war?
So I think there was a question, I believe, in the last session about how do we engage with people who have bad faith sort of attacks.
Yeah, yes.
And I think it's important for us to recognize that in many ways those bad faith actors are dominating the airways. They're certainly dominating platforms like Twitter, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are in the majority, right? That they are representative of most people in this world, or even most people in this city, our nation. And I the reason why I mention that is because if we can even think past them, right, and think about regular everyday people who are just going about their lives, right, trying to sort of navigate this society, and who are open, who are first being, of course, targeted with all this propaganda, but at the same time, they have relationships, maybe personal relationships, that cause them to not necessarily fully internalize it. those are the people we should be thinking about and writing to and speaking to. And as Professor Gonzales Rose stated, approaching them with love, because they will feel it and see that. And certainly those folks who are engaging with propaganda, not approaching with love. And so you approach with that level of empathy, people respond to that.
Yeah. So we're in a moment which I think many people would describe as less than hopeful. Can you identify a time in your personal history where you felt most hopeful about our ability to eliminate racism, combat racism?
So
And why? What was it about that time?
I was actually quite hopeful in 2017. And I think the reason why I was hopeful is because this was sort of the aftermath of, of Trump's election. And it seemed to me that there certainly were many people who tried to make Trump into this sort of singular figure of badness. But I think there were more and more people who, at least it seemed to me, who recognized his election as the outgrowth of something deeper that was, problematic, in our society, and then started thinking very deeply, about that, and started organizing and energizing themselves and organizing the largest women's march, in history. And I think I was quite hopeful, in that moment. I was shocked because I had published this 500-page book, Stand from the Beginning, and people were like reading it, trying to understand how we got to this point. But I think I was actually quite hopeful, then, even more so than I am now, because of the intellectual pursuits, that people were having. Even in the summer of 2020, I didn't necessarily feel that people had this deep intellectual, that people were coming to books or written, let's say, by Black writers because of a deep and searing sort of intellectual desire. It seemed to be more of a sort of everybody else is doing it, right? And so I don't know, there was something about 2017, in which I felt that. And was also interesting was, I think, particularly the way Black Americans experienced the election of Trump was radically different, I think, than the way many white Americans, experienced it. And I would say the way people of color experienced it sort of more broadly was different than many, white Americans. And I think that was also instructive for both peoples of color and white Americans, sort of witnessing that differing sort of response that I think was because I think white Americans were like, why did it didn't even seem like that big of a deal to them, like in the sense that people of color were horrified, but at the same time, it didn't affect them as deeply. And then I think people of color recognizing the ways in which white Americans responded, many, so certainly not all, I think there was this sense that, well, they really did buy into this post-racial madness, right? Which I think then the next question became why? And so I think there was a lot of introspection. And I think I'm most hopeful when people are engaged in serious and deep introspection.
I really like that because as comparing it to 2017 to 2020, because the people were really in a different moment where they were forced to, in a different way, voluntarily really think more deeply about how race and racism were functioning in the country, right? So people were really shocked. What I remember from a lot of my friends is that people were really shocked that Trump could win in liberal circles, were really shocked in the country. And I think that people of color were a little bit less shocked about that. As you know, one comedian said that he wasn't shocked because he sort of understood racism, the way it functioned all along. And 2020, I love what you said about it was less voluntary because we were all during the pandemic. We were, at home and people were forced to watch in a way, something that they might have overlooked before, and forced to grapple with things in a way. And so I could see why that would be more hopeful than a 2020 moment, which it was harder to look away. It was harder to be a white person in the United States and look away at kind of the racism that was happening because we were all home. We were all glued to our TVs in a different way. So that's really interesting. I really like that perspective. How about giving us some advice? So I know audience members want to know. They're wondering what they can do to help advance the cause of the anti-racism movement, and what could individual people do in a system, a system we're talking about grappling with structural racism.
Well, I mean, I think that, to me, it's going to take a social movement in order to ultimately and finally deconstruct racism. And the only way in which we create a social movement that's powerful enough to abolish racism is if we have organizations and institutions and individuals, again, who are in positions of power, who can carry that through. And so I just don't want to underestimate the importance of each of us seizing that position of power, each of us building and creating or joining or supporting, anti-racist organizations, particularly in this moment when they're under attack. But I also think it's important for us to constantly be students, and to constantly recognize being anti-racist as a journey, as a journey of unlearning, and learning, as a journey of transforming ourselves to transform our society. And so this is not a place for ego. This is not a place for even insecurity. For us to think lowly or highly about ourselves. This is a place for us to learn ourselves and learn our society, and to grow ourselves and to even give ourselves some grace in that we were born into a world and into a narrative and social environment that specifically, clinically sought to make us believe that inequity, racial inequity, is normal, because those people on the lower or dying end of those inequities, that there's something wrong with them, right? People have more because they are more. Like, we were systematically taught those ideas so that ultimately we won't resist. And so it's a process sort of unlearning those ideas. In many ways, we don't even necessarily know, right, just how much we've been conditioned. It's like we don't even know that it's raining outside and how wet we are, right, until somebody gives us an umbrella. So we shouldn't fight them when they give us an umbrella. And so I think I don't also want to underestimate the importance of that deep intellectual engagement that we need to be doing with ourselves, right, so that we don't continue to contribute, to the harm.
Can I open it up for any people who have questions out here? Keenan.
So I thought it was really interesting, Dr. Kendi, you saying that you were very hopeful in 2017, in part because we saw this sort of, that there was a buy-in to the idea of a post-racial America, and we were able to start debunking that. And I guess my question for both speakers is, it seems like we're seeing a little bit of that buy-in at the level of the Supreme Court in some of the language that they've been putting out there. And so how do we start debunking this in 2017? How do we keep debunking it now?
Yeah.
So after the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action, I actually wrote a piece with a colleague that made the case that race neutral is the new separate but equal. And the reason why we decided to pursue that piece is, again, at a narrative level, right? We need to be able to connect what's happening in our time to obviously what's happening, previously. And as I suspect each of you certainly know, the court sort of blindfolded themselves as it related to all the disparities in schooling and imagined that it was equal to justify legally the sort of ongoing segregation for upwards of 50 years. Similarly, you have the court today completely denying the ways in which white students receive preferential treatment as it relates to legacy admissions, as it relates to boosts in admissions when you're a child of a faculty or staff member, as it relates to boost in admissions when you are the relative of a donor, as it relates to boost in admissions when you are an athlete, and the vast majority of college athletes don't play basketball and football and are disproportionately white. So they can just completely ignore the ways in which nearly half of a Harvard class was admitted through those four forms of preferential treatment, and then claim that all those admissions factors are race, quote, neutral, and then this one over here that's a minor admissions factor is, quote, race conscious, and it's the problem, and we should eliminate that. I mean, it is, to me, and we wrote in the piece, it is indicative, of the court claiming that Mississippi schools were equal in 1912. I mean, it's the same sort of logic. And I think we just need to, we need to call that out. And we need to and I think certainly law students and law faculty, who know this the best, certainly need to call it out.
So I understand what your frustration in part, because the desire to want to be post-racial is kind of a desire to want to get past everything without actually grappling with grappling with our histories, grappling with different people's realities, all of those things. And I guess what I heard when you were talking about why that made you so hopeful, I didn't hear that wasn't part of it, that it was really that people were not just wanting to be post-racial, but they were wanting to engage with things intellectually. They were wanting to learn. And so that's very different from, I think, from other moments. That there was a desire to kind of dig deeper underneath. Now, we don't know if that's actually true or not, but that maybe that 2017 moment produced that. And I agree with you absolutely. That's absolutely being bought in. And I think that people are buying into that language precisely because they want us to be at a point where we're past these things and they don't want to do the work of engaging in it. Again, it highlights a really important moment about the power of narrative. And I love this, Lonnie Guinier, the late Lonnie Guinier and Gerald Torres used to always have this kind of, they said there are 3 rules that we always need to understand. And they're talking about narratives and the ways in which inequality reproduces itself. And this is that there are always winners and losers in our society, right? And the winners are the people who get to construct the rules about how you win. And they construct those rules in ways that they're gonna allow themselves and people like them to keep winning. And then that's the second part. And then the third part is that they then have a story, a narrative, which I think we all sort of talked about why, if you're one of the losers, why you lost. Right, you didn't work hard enough, a variety of different, whatever the reasons are, the reasons that we grow up when we're learning about attitudinal racism, about why things are the way they are and why inequalities look natural to people. And so I do think that there's huge buy-in to that. I do agree with you that our desire to be post-racial plays a huge role in that. But there's the tiny things, and maybe we get too happy about the tiny things, like people wanting to engage with the intellectual part and teaching themselves. So I didn't say anything hopeful. I said it was really pessimistic. But I don't know if I got that. Are there any more questions? Yes.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Caroline Brady. A lot of the conversation has, we've touched on education and the role conversations are playing in the classrooms and even in our earlier panel. I guess I'm wondering, because we see now so many attacks, I guess I'm thinking specifically in Florida about, no CRT in the K through 12 classroom, and banning books written predominantly by Black authors and by LGBTQ authors. And I'm wondering if you guys have anything to comment on or anything to say about what the role of people who are in those systems, educators, students, families, what roles they can play in resisting these mandates from state legislatures.
Yeah. I saw I can't even remember the book, but I saw something I thought was super powerful. It was in Florida. There was a story, I can't remember what the book, it was a children's book that sort of everyone on the planet would agree shouldn't have been banned, but it was banned from Florida, from schools in a particular Florida district, school district. And there was a white father who was just angry, and he was the one who took it public. And he challenged it. And I think that, for me, I was like, it almost had me in tears, right? That here was this dad who was really upset that his kid didn't get to read this book. And he, number one, he had people's ears in a way that, like, I wouldn't have had if that wasn't been my kid in a school district they had. So that was really, really important, that people who feel like they have voice, and they may have voice that may give them more access to particular media outlets, that may allow those stories to get more national, that may give a way for people to connect to the kind of the absurdity of some of these book bans and a variety of other bans, right? Should really engage in those actions. I mean, I was moved by it. I thought it was precisely the right thing. I thought it was meaningful that it was a white father saying this and not a Black parent. And I remember watching it thinking there might have been an entirely different reaction had it been a Black parent who was saying, it's ridiculous if this book wasn't being offered. And so I would encourage people to really kind of, in those systems, to use their voices in ways, particularly if they feel like they have the capital, of social or political capital, to do so.
And I would just add that I think it's important for us to innovate protest tactics, and so that really lean on the vulnerabilities of these laws. So to give an example, everybody understands the ways in which, if you conduct a sit-in in a business that's segregated, the effects of that is to drive customers away from the business. And thereby, so there isn't just a sort of moral action. It literally harms the business itself, right? Similarly, I think it was in Virginia, the governor set up a, quote, tip line to give students and teachers and parents the ability to, quote, call the line if they notice someone who is teaching divisive concepts. So what actually people did was they flooded the line, which made it impossible for that to be utilized, right? And so I think and this is happening. I think you have organizations and bodies that are thinking about sort of innovative protest techniques to undermine these laws. I think in the case of Florida, it is going to be interesting when you have 14 or 11 people who's responsible for like 70% of the book bans, when they start banning like books on Thomas Jefferson, when they start banning the Bible, when they start banning these other books, right? It's going to be very interesting to see the ways in which the state is going to respond, right? Because they're either going to have to remove that capability, right? Because you also have to understand that these are states, and I should say DeSantis in particular is trying to project this idea of equality, right? That this is not an attempt to specifically target books authored by people of color or authored by queer authors. So if we start banning heterosexual authors and white authors, it'll be very interesting to see how these states respond. And that's already happening, right? And so I think we have to innovate protest techniques as they innovate laws. I just think that as we continue to do that, it makes these measures, not only makes them ineffective, but it demonstrates the inherent racism within them.
I mean, I think the other thing that it would be, although I completely understand, is if people are from various states. I'm from Texas, and I can't say that I've done this because I'm not in Texas. But if you're from Florida or Texas, to really consider going back to those spaces as people who are native to those states and engaging in the fight. I think what's happened is so many people have left various different states and have kind of conceded, right? Conceded the battle there.
Earlier in the panel, we heard a lot about like the faith in students, and I think in the larger conversation, young people in general to carry this work forward. But in the context of students, while I found that really empowering to be the ones driving this, it's also a little bit, to me, frustrating at times, feeling like the onus is on us when we are in the lowest position of power. We have the most to lose. We have, a huge power imbalance, and we are also in the space of consumer, right? And also was brought up as an example, but lots of affinity group leaderships and the people running those, making those spaces safer, are unpaid and uncredited. And the students themselves are also providing an essential service to the school, only because the institutions have not provided it for them. So I guess my question is, in the larger conversation, both in like academic institutions and in the nation, like how can institutions and people with more power better protect and enable students to be able to do this labor that is so essential?
Yeah. So I guess one thing I would say is that always every institution is a reflection of society, right? So one of the things is there is racism out in greater society and there's racism here. And it's really hard as a community to combat that, to lessen it, right? Without every single person taking ownership over it. And so we work on our part in making sure, trying to make, speaking as administrator, right? We try to work on our part in making sure that like faculty and staff are taking ownership of it. We try to give people the tools to do that. We try to give students support and education to do that as well. And I think one of the reasons, I don't think anyone's saying at all that like students need to do it on their own, but like that engage too in the problem solving process and don't concede things, right? Or don't concede the vote. So I think one of the things you also often hear about Generation Z is like, don't, like a lot of people are saying, I'm not gonna vote for this person, or I'm not gonna vote for that person. But like sometimes a vote for one person or against another person means a vote for someone else, right? Or, or taking yourself out the process altogether, even if it's a broken system, which I completely agree that it's in many ways a broken system, but taking yourself out of that system means that it will never change. And so I think when I was hearing the panelists talk about young people engaging in it, was kind of like, don't take yourself out of the process. Like join us in the ownership and like kind of dealing with these problems. I also think that, frankly, I can speak from my generation, I think we take a lot of inspiration from y'all. I love like Gen Z that, you expect the world to be the way that we promised you it would be. That you push back on questions about inequality and you are like, I think your generation's really committed to it in a way that no other, I think studies have shown that no other generation is. And so I think that's good to have young people pushing people like me, who maybe were once hopeful but are a little bit jaded and cynical, right? Right, to sort of remind them about the various possibilities. So I think that's part of too what people are asking for. I guess I can't speak. I'd love to hear if like any of the speakers or panelists were here to talk about it. But that's just my view. And I'm obviously I'm the man, technically, so.
Well, this is a hard question for me, partly because my first book was on student activism, particularly Black student activism in the late 60s, early 1970s. And so for me, what students have been able to achieve, when they recognized their power and organized, together has just been nothing short of extraordinary. With that being said, the student of 1968 did not necessarily have to deal with crippling levels of student debt. The student of 1968 was less likely to need to work full time, right, when she, went to school. The student of 1968 was fearing that, he would be drafted, and which sort of, in a way, made sort of the urgency of transformation, that much more. And so I just think that it is a different time, and I think you spoke to the challenges that students face, but I also think that one of the secrets of previous generations of students, and I think certainly some students are recognizing this today, is there was a recognition of their power, right? And so I think that, I think at some point you mentioned like sort of the empowering of the student, from people who have more power. I really want to encourage students for you to recognize your own power, irrespective of administrators and faculty and community members, because that is going to be critical, in organizing. And in many types of ways, students have the ability to become the most powerful force on campus. Now, the way campuses are set up, it's to consistently disempower students, and in so many different types of ways, but that doesn't necessarily mean that recognition and that organizing, is not possible, if that makes sense.
I want to say something because I always feel like I need to write this because I think it's really really important. There are huge differences, I think, between students now and students. And number one, I think the major difference is we're an educational system that wasn't created for the students that are currently enrolling. Huge demographic shifts in what the student body looks like. The student of 1968 was a wealthier student. Right? They were not students like many of the students in this classroom, right? The wealth disparities that I think we find ourselves in various classes now didn't look the same way in 1968. And so I think there are a lot of structural factors playing into it, and I think there's a lot of things about the way the economic model of higher education works and everything that's also playing into it. I agree with much of what you said, but I do think that there are like major structural differences and major like demographic differences that are playing a huge role in how so much that's happening in our society now is working out for students. And I think at some point I've got to bite the bullet and just lay this all out. So anyway, I agree. Yeah. Kate.
Yeah, I have been thinking of one of the things that was quite difficult about the events in the last year, Florida, and the anti-divisive and anti-CRT admissions, is that it has been relatively bloodless from the standpoint of triggering or bringing on protests, relative to sort of how bodily George Floyd was, how the post-Dobbs bodily consequences for women, and that story was very well told immediately post-Dobbs, Gaza, the kinds of things that bring students or bring people to protest have such a bodily quality. And relative to that, anti-CRT book banning, affirmative action are very conceptual and feel bloodless, and they're not bringing, students are not protesting SFFA, from what I'm seeing, and I just wonder what impact that has.
I think that's an incredibly important observation, and it's actually something I've been thinking about for quite some time, and I just want to sort of preview a piece I've been thinking about, and that's specifically along these lines, and that is that if we think of the lynching era a century ago, most of particularly the Black people who were lynched were people who were in positions of power and influence. And so, of course, we've heard the narrative that people who were lynched were like rapists, but what was actually the case is it was an attempt to drive particularly Black people from positions of power and influence, and they were using those positions to create more justice, in their communities. And so there was a social and political environment that allowed mobs or even individuals to murder those people, right? We're not necessarily in a social and political environment that allows like a Christopher Rufo to just go out and shoot and kill somebody and get away with it, right? But they can still use mechanisms to drive that person from a position of power and influence, which ultimately, if we really think about the lynching era, like that was the fundamental objective. And certainly then the side objective was to cause fear among other people from climbing into those same places, right? And so the same scenario is happening now, in which you have people who are being driven from positions of power and influence, and then that is creating fear. It's literally, I suspect there are Black women who are like, I am fearful of taking the presidency at Harvard, right? Because of what happened, to the previous president. And so, I've just been thinking about the way in which lynching, has transformed. So we've thought about lynching certainly in this day and age as relates to people being killed by police, which to me is certainly relevant, but I think it's also operating at this level. And this speaks to what you're talking about, in which the increased sophistication, of violence, of racist violence, right? That it's increasingly become bloodless, to use your term, because the bloodless aspects of it reduces the resistance, which then allows it to be a much more effective tool. And so I think we have to constantly recognize the ways in which these tactics are becoming increasingly sophisticated to achieve similar ends in different types of ways.
I think that would be an amazing piece, actually. I think it would be an amazing piece. I love that. I love your response, and I agree with it in many ways. It is a kind of a new form, right? And the display, right? How you would leave the body out, right? For everybody to see. It's a different thing to display, but watching it. I actually, weirdly, I had this experience. I attended a Association of Governing Boards conference recently, and I went to a talk about student success, a panel about student success, with people from universities that wouldn't be like our peers. So it was like one woman was from Denver Metropolitan College, and it was a phenomenal panel, really phenomenal panel. But I wonder if one of the reasons why, at least just thinking about this, I was so moved by the entire conversation, because I sat there thinking I have existed in terms of the schools that I've gone in and worked at, in this kind of country club education that is not the experience of most students. And I think that it's true also about affirmative action and selective admissions. It's not something that's gonna get all of young people really angry, because it affects such a small, pretty elite group. Now, I don't mean elite like in terms of their backgrounds, but the people who would get access to those institutions of students. And so you wouldn't see a mass movement with something like that, because not everybody can relate to it. Not even everybody in college, not even most people in college could relate to that. And for me, it was really like it's reshaping my own thinking, having attended that panel, because it did really highlight for me the way in which we at BU and other places like BU are really in this sort of rarefied air in terms of educational spaces and the issues our students are dealing with.
And can I just mention one more thing? I think that there is an opportunity for us through language to demonstrate how these seemingly bloodless rulings or laws are actually quite bloody. And so I think, to give one example, I think the ways in which you've had like feminist thinkers who have described this sort of attack on reproductive rights as leading to forced births. Like the term forced births has, to me, I mean, that's the type of term that then that allows people to recognize how, you know, such a ruling could have this type of sort of visceral, violent effect, but it also allows to me for more people to recognize how that ruling is going to directly affect them personally. And so I think there are some bright spots, right? And I think that is a great, you know, example. I just hope that term doesn't become too popular because then people will say it's no longer radical.